Welcome again. I'll give you some context of what we're doing today. This is an emotional intelligence focused workshop. And the objective is to not talk a lot about the terms and concepts of emotional intelligence, but actually go through an exercise that will help you understand what one of the key terms means. And if nothing more, it's an exercise you can take with you to use in your organization. And it's one of many that I've developed over time that I use in settings like this. You see how it's structured. A little bit of information about a concept, one of the main emotional intelligence concepts. Then we'll watch a video with Daniel Goleman and another individual that helps set the stage and references some of the material. Then I'll use a case study from my research that illustrates the subject matter, and then we'll go right into the exercise. In India, I know people use the term EQ. So I have to make just to let you know, I say EI, I'm trying to say EQ while I'm here, but EI and EQ, for the most part, refer to ESI and SI also. So social intelligence, emotional and social intelligence, EQ and EI, they're all the same thing in this context. I will probably continue to say EI, I'm sorry. As this is a event focused on mindfulness, and a lot of my research explored the way mindfulness is used by organizational leaders. I have this diagram that builds out quickly how emotional intelligence relates to mindfulness. And all of the main emotional intelligence theories that you may have heard, there's the Daniel Goleman and Boyatsa's theory, which is called the mixed model. Then there's Salovey, Meyer, and Caruso, you may have heard of. Then there's Baran. They have slight differences in the details, but at the high level, these four circles represent a commonality. So all the work I do fits within the context of all of those models. Self-awareness is the core, and that's why it's the big circle. When people begin to focus on self-awareness, that's when they begin to receive some information about how they can develop themselves. That leads to some decisions around self-management that begin to manifest themselves in behaviors that are hopefully more effective. And often it takes people to this step of just wondering if those we interact with really understand who we are, and if our expressions are being received in the manner in which we think they are, or we intend they are. So it's a question of intent. Did the person understand me? Or did I say what I thought they would understand, but I didn't confirm, or I didn't look for body language or some indication that they really understood what my intent was? And of course, that fits into the social awareness area, looking more at what's happening around us and how people perceive us and whether or not they're willing to help us, they're willing to be supportive of us in our endeavors in the workplace. A big part of that then leads into things like empathy and compassion. How do we look around us for what others really need? And what's our role? We look at relationship management in fulfilling some of those needs or acknowledging those needs and making sure that we're building relationships that are mutually beneficial and that we know everyone involved is receiving the value that they need. And I refer to this as the upward spiral, because the information that you gain going in this circle counterclockwise feeds back into your self-awareness, and you learn a little bit more, you experiment with the behavior, you see how that works or doesn't work, and you continue to improve. Mindfulness is like a ring that fits in the center of that, because mindfulness is a type of self-awareness, and it's an excellent tool for observing your reactions and your mental state. However, what you do with that information goes into the spectrum and the realm of emotional intelligence. So mindfulness helps you gather the knowledge and the insight about yourself. But when you start to analyze that or do something with the information, now you're taking it a little bit deeper. Today, what we're focusing on is probably the biggest issue people face in organizations, and it's about emotional reactivity. And that fits back into the self-management circle, the yellow or orange one on the left there. The question we'll focus on first is just to ask yourself and think about a moment where you realize you didn't handle a situation effectively. And if it's something about treating a coworker inappropriately, or if it's a way that you realize later actually damaged your reputation, that's going to be our area of focus today, because that's a great feedback tool for development. The area of exploration, once you can acknowledge an incident like that, is, was it something you chose to do, or did you feel like it just happened? So looking more into how we can control the way our emotions influence our behaviors. And as things continue to get more and more hectic and we continue to struggle with more data overload, it's important to note that this isn't necessarily our fault. It's not an issue of blame necessarily. We're living in a society that's becoming more and more overwhelming. And so being emotionally reactive is a logical and normal reaction to the environments that we often find ourselves in. A few statistics that shed light on that. When we look at the amount of time people spend reacting to distractions and how long it takes to refocus your attention, you can start to understand why you might be frustrated with yourself about not having a productive day. And obviously many of us struggle with that, but having a sense of the fact that we're in an environment that influences us in a way that almost takes control away from us when it comes to emotional self-management, that's an important point to start with. When you have distractions, we have compensation reactions, which I think we're all familiar with, and they lead us to the classic response of, I'll just do more work. I'll get caught up and I'll answer all 900 emails in my inbox, and then I'll be able to relax. And that's not usually what happens. We become more stressed and more frustrated, and that leads to less emotional balance. Interestingly, in the US, we find that a large percentage of workers are not in an environment where they're able to even discuss this with their managers. And that creates another cycle of frustration and probably depression and anxiety in some cases. So let's run this video quickly. It's Dr. Goleman and Dr. Davidson talking about the amygdala hijack. We've heard some people talking about it earlier today. Here they'll explore it in a little more detail because it relates directly to what we're talking about.
I remember when I wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, I drew on your work and also Joseph Ledoux's, and talked about an amygdala hijack, which is when the amygdala overreacts and actually takes over and drives the prefrontal cortex. You're now talking about reversing that process.
Yes, exactly. And so your concept of amygdala hijack actually is based upon the fact that these connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are bidirectional. We know that there's good evidence for that. So
they go both ways.
They go both ways. So the amygdala can hijack the prefrontal cortex and jangle it, which disrupts our ability to plan. It disrupts our ability to guide our behavior effectively. But we also know that the prefrontal cortex can modulate the amygdala. So that's the other direction. And using cognitive strategies like perspective taking can help modulate the amygdala. There are also other kinds of strategies which can be deployed. And we have recent evidence to suggest that with long-term mindfulness meditation practice, the rate at which the amygdala recovers from an adverse event gets shorter. So it recovers more quickly.
So
but it only does that after a fair amount of practice.
So what do you do in mindfulness meditation? What's the actual tactic that you're practicing, or the skill?
Well, the actual tactic is a version of the kind of labeling that you described, which is acknowledging these thoughts and feelings, but not overly identifying with them, observing that they're present, and not being carried away by them, and acknowledging them for what they are. This is a thought. This is a feeling, and not treating them particularly in any kind of special way. And that helps to recover more quickly.
It reminds me of a maxim from cognitive therapy, which I found very powerful. You don't have to believe your thoughts, particularly the ones that are upsetting you.
Exactly.
And I think all of these strategies take that as a premise.
Absolutely.
Because our upsetting thoughts are very seductive, very powerful. Why that guy? You know, the emotion gives it a lot of conviction. But what you're saying is if you just note that and step back and think, well, this happens to a lot of other people, it's not just me, or I'm getting upset, or simply don't judge it or don't be sucked in by it, just let it be. It's going to dampen down and you're going to recover more quickly.
Yes, absolutely. And many people, I think, believe that that's the case, that if we can just look at our thoughts in that way, that would be beneficial, and that we shouldn't believe all our thoughts. But there's a big difference between understanding that cognitively and being able to embody that kind of characteristic. And this is where the difference that we've learned about in neuroscience between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge is so important. Declarative knowledge is knowing about stuff.
Right.
So it's knowing the value of something like that. And procedural knowledge is embodied knowledge.
So right here, for example, just hearing us say it is a beginning, but it's not enough.
Exactly.
You need to put it into practice.
Yes.
Say that thoughts come into our mind, he says that don't listen to all your thoughts. Is that really possible? Because they're there.
Well, listening to them and reacting to them are two different things. And I think that will be a whole nother metaphysical debate we don't need to get into. But the trick that they're describing there is actually that if you recognize a thought or an impulse or a feeling and you identify it, you label it, you're engaging a different part of your brain. So you're switching to the prefrontal cortex where you have reasoning and you can actually short circuit a reaction. You can engage a different neural circuit so that you're in control of the way your emotions are expressed. Yes?
And Mark Epstein's book on thoughts without a thinker make this very, very fruitful.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts without a thinker? Right.
Mark Epstein's book.
Right, and I think it becomes even a philosophical debate that we might all explore at later times, but the point is you can observe a thought or a feeling or a reaction, and you can teach yourself to control the way that you outwardly express that. And you can also control the way that it affects you internally. So one of the things I found in my research when talking with people who had really struggled with these issues when they were under a lot of stress was that they learned to just label it. And they would say, they'd imagine saying it in their mind. I'm having an amygdala hijack right now. I'm not going to do this. And you actually switch the region of your brain that's engaged in that moment where the energy is going, for lack of a better term. So it's a great tool to work with. Yes?
Which thoughts do you believe in?
That's up to the individual, I think. The thoughts, I think we probably all have thoughts that maybe we don't wish we did. The key is don't focus on judging it right away, just make sure it doesn't control you without you deciding what the effect is going to be. That's really the message they have, is around you can develop the ability to make those decisions.
In the Buddhist meditation pedagogy, I think they have already sorted out this question by giving in some ethics that these are the right thoughts, these are the right mindfulness. But somehow I think this is lacking in the secular form because it becomes very much prone to context.
Yes.
And you can essentially make it, you can brainwash yourself into believing in what can be a right action and what cannot be a right action.
Exactly, and that can be changed. So it's a good point. It is contextual, probably mostly based on culture. How you're going to decide to interpret a thought or an impulse. But again, the key is that you become aware of it before you act upon it.
I would like to say that the minute you assign whether it's a right thought or a wrong thought, you're being judgmental about the thought. And the belief that we carry, that itself is a thought. The whole idea is to distance ourselves from the thought, from the belief, and just see you different from your thought. You are a different entity from your thought. That's it.
Exactly. Could everyone hear that? I couldn't have articulated it better than what she just said. It is about observing the thought and not applying judgment to it, and then deciding to take action or not.
But then in that case, what I essentially meant was, what is a useful thought I should listen to, and what is a thought that I should ignore. So a criteria, possibly according to the goal that I want to achieve, that perhaps I'm working, there are some thoughts about the urgency, perhaps I can just ignore those thoughts and rather allow some useful thoughts to arise and act upon them.
Right. Again, it's contextual. It depends on the situation. And is it a derailing thought or is it a productive thought? Let's just focus there in a workplace environment. If my impulse was to shout at someone who made a mistake, will that get me a short-term result? Or do I want that person to be more trusting and supportive of me for the next 5 years? Well, I want to have the ability to regulate my reaction so that I don't harm myself that way.
Just wanting to respond to the gentleman there in terms of which thought should we listen to and act upon. One thing that might help over here, and you could suggest also whether we're thinking in the right direction, is to check our own intentions and how we're making an appraisal of the situation, how we're evaluating the outcomes. If our intention is harmful to ourselves as well as to others around us, to the organization at large, well then we have an answer. But if our intention is to drive personal agenda, again we have an answer. But if it's not, and if it's more collaborative and useful in the long run.
Right, that's a great example, and we had a brief discussion before this session started along those lines. When you look at this subject matter from an organizational standpoint, you need your employees to have some of that criteria. What are we working towards that is the greater good, not just serving of the individual or what I think my boss would be happy with, right? What's going to truly motivate me, and those are going to be the guiding criteria. But again, they're contextual.
I would add here with that it would be more of positive thought than right or wrong thought. If it is a positive, then it's logical. Within collaboration with team members, it will go and give positive results only.
Right, and that goes back to the concept of judgmental. And in most of the definitions of mindfulness, there's a point about being non-judgmental in what you observe. And as long as you're operating in that place, you can decide whether or not it's productive or counterproductive given the circumstances. So I like the way you framed that. Positive and orient it towards what's positive, or at least assess whether or not it's productive towards the goals that you're focused on. And so it's a tool. It doesn't necessarily mean it won't fall into the wrong hands in some cases, but it's a tool nonetheless. It is a skill set. And we can use that when we observe and understand our emotions. That puts us along the path of being able to control the way they affect us. And a quick summary of a brief diagram, I guess, that builds out this, where we're focused. If everything's going normally and you have sensory input, your amygdala is involved, but your prefrontal cortex is also involved, and you're having a conscious response. When you get into that amygdala hijack, you're going to bypass a lot of the higher decision-making processes that would probably keep you in a better situation, unless it was a life-threatening situation, which we know as the fight or flight response. A case study to put this more into context, and this is from one of the organizational leaders that I interviewed in some of my research recently. I named this individual Phil just to protect his identity because he actually shared some very insightful things with me. He described himself as being a frustrated and unpleasant manager, and he's still a fairly senior manager at a well-known global organization. And I engaged with him in a study of how organizational leaders used mindfulness to improve their performance. So he more or less gave me his life story leading up to how he started to study mindfulness, why, and what the circumstances were. And for him to say he was a frustrated and unpleasant person showed that he had achieved at least some level of mindfulness. He was very annoyed by the people he worked with, but he didn't know why. He just knew he found them annoying. And he actually was aware of the fact that he was a bully in the workplace, but he felt that had gotten him results, so he was fine with it. He was conscious of it, but he was perfectly comfortable with it. And probably 50% of the people I've interviewed doing this research were like Phil. They hit a career plateau. And I would describe it similar to what we talked about earlier today. They were in a command control framework, so they were whipping people to achieve goals. And you can only whip so many people and spend so many hours in the day looking over everyone's shoulder. So they ran out of the capacity to lead in that manner. So he wasn't getting promoted, and he was pretty sure he was going to get fired. if he couldn't find some other way to get his teams to perform. And that naturally led to a lot of stress and anger. So he ended up in an emergency room thinking he was having a heart attack at about the age of 35. And turned out he wasn't having a heart attack, he was having an anxiety attack. And the country that he lives in, part of their healthcare process required that person in his circumstances went through some psychological counseling as an outpatient process. And that's how he was introduced to mindfulness practice. And that started him along this course of developing self-awareness. And so the intervention that he found himself in was he did have some coaching, but interestingly enough, in his own organization, there were other people who had gone through this same experience that came out of the shadows and said, I've been there, let me coach you a little bit now. I can see the struggles you're having, and let me help you work through those the way I did. But he did actually have mindfulness instructors and some coaches that helped him. He focused on just daily emotional awareness. That was his starting point, because he wanted to know why he was angry and frustrated all the time. And spending some time on that every day, just assessing his emotional state, was a big step in the right direction for him. He then started to learn how to observe how he felt about other people and what might be triggering his emotional reactions. So he developed a self-observation. He used journaling and logs, which many of you are familiar with. It's a great tool just to see if you're making progress or see if there are patterns in your experience over time. And he started to work on the understanding what caused him to have a stressful or anxious response. For him, and this is another interesting thing I think is probably more common than we want to admit, he realized he'd basically been unhappy and anxious since early childhood. These were traits and a state of experience he had brought with him his whole life. And so he deconstructed what had happened in his childhood, which was pretty difficult and stressful, and realized that a lot of his interpersonal strategies, I wouldn't call them skills, but his interpersonal strategies that had been survival tools had brought him to the point in his career where he was, but they were not going to take him any farther. So he had to go back and really analyze what was the belief system that had supported his goals up until this point, but we're just going to send him into an endless cycle of anxiety attacks if he didn't change. One thing he noticed was that he had viewed relationships as transactional, and he thought that's what everybody viewed the world as. It had not occurred to him that there were other more meaningful, trusting relationships possible out there, because he hadn't really experienced those in his childhood. He made another comment to me that I thought was interesting. He'd had many 360 peer reviews. He'd gone through all the corporate training and evaluations. He said those didn't affect him because he didn't trust anyone. So whatever those anonymous 360 feedback reviews came back and said from his peers and his superiors, he had already decided either they were out to get him, or they didn't know what they were talking about, or he just couldn't trust them. For him to realize that about himself was profound, and to understand how that was having a negative impact on his career was also profound. Through this, another insight he had was around judgment, and that he judged other people because he held them up to these same fairly vicious standards that he had always held himself up to. And the moment he realized that, then the nature of his relationships with his coworkers started to change. He hadn't set out to have negative views of other people. He just hadn't realized that he was looking at the whole world from the standpoint of the way he judged himself. And when he became conscious of it, he was able to drop that lens of viewing other people. And finally, he learned that trust and loyalty and engagement were earned through consistent, nice behavior and actually legitimately showing an interest in other people. So this is an interesting finding I had in my research. A number of people I spent time with actually, in a variety of ways, reported to me that they thought emotional intelligence and mindfulness could be used as ways to become more manipulative. And as they began to try and experiment with that, they realized that people were not really responding to it the way they thought they would. So they actually started to try to fake empathy. So Phil had that same experience. He tried to force himself to be more empathetic. And he eventually did become empathetic. He eventually did start to care about what was happening with his coworkers and the people that he managed.
Is that also perhaps because before that, he never really sat and listened? Being empathetic is also about listening.
Absolutely.
You force yourself to do that. You're suddenly hearing someone else's perspective without. Maybe you're having judgment, but you're just listening because you're supposed to.
Right, listening to respond rather than listening to learn. And he was a classic example of that. He was always thinking about his agenda, his bias, and how he was going to push that through. So he wasn't learning from other people either, which was a good breakthrough for him to have also. Well, his life became less stressful and actually became more fulfilling because he actually started to have more quality relationships in the workplace and in his personal life. And he's not the only person who reported to me that while his performance improved, and incidentally he didn't lose his job, he did get promoted, but the amount of hours he worked during a week declined. And there were a number of reasons for that. One, he wasn't in the panic mode of, I need to work more hours to feel like I'm in control of what's happening. He realized that wasn't working, but he also trusted people, and he had them involved in providing and supporting his success in a way that he hadn't before. So a lot of his workload was distributed when he became able to better trust people. As I said, he was promoted and actually eventually was put in charge of helping people go through the same thing he went through. So it was a nice cycle of learning that occurred there. He also was put in charge of mentoring difficult employees, which he laughed about, and I still find it funny. But again, he's not the only person I've interviewed who once they demonstrated the ability to transform themselves, they were then asked to help 3 or 4 other people that were like they were 5 years before. His health improved dramatically, which we're glad to hear, and his quality of life also improved. And the 360 reviews improved. Yes.
Did he take notice of them or acknowledge them? That's the question.
He seemed to, but they have a metric, and so he said the metrics improved. So, you had a question.
How long it took to go through this transformation process for this person? How long it took?
I would say it was around 2 years for him. Yeah, and I think it was fairly intensive. And people ask me these questions, and all the different people I've researched and studied and interviewed, the time frame is different. So I want you to keep that in mind. There's not one fixed time frame where you complete mindfulness training and you have X, Y, and Z results. A lot of it is very relevant or relative to context and circumstance.
So when you talk about him, this is there was a medical trigger which happened for him to undertake this process. So when we work in the corporate environment, we see a lot of people who need to undergo this kind of transformation. Is there any other trigger which can happen? Because I see this as very, very important, and
right.
Just making it, putting it forward to them doesn't, create any impact, and they don't even acknowledge the same.
Adding to that question, see, people start taking advantage of when you are so empathetic to others. So how to handle it?
Right. So that's a great question, and I see different answers to that across the spectrum of work that I do, and I've done a lot of work in healthcare as well. And the core answer, the simple answer, is that the individual has to come to the conclusion that some work needs to be done. And I know that's not the answer we often want to hear, but there are some workarounds for that are quite interesting. I'll give you an example of a heart surgeon. I used to own a surgery center. I was the only non-physician partner of this surgery center, which had a variety of unintended learning opportunities for me, as I'm sure you can imagine. I'll tell you a story about a heart surgeon who was having a lot of difficulty, and all the interventions were not working. So the traditional interventions that you'd see in the U.S. healthcare system for an individual like that. So the next level of intervention was, well, let's have some of the other doctors talk to him and see if they can connect and get him to change his behavior. It wasn't working. Eventually, what they did is they found another heart surgeon who had graduated from a more prestigious university and a more prestigious residency program to come in and tell him how he had fixed those problems himself, and that's when he listened. And he actually did recover from the majority of those problems. So that's one strategy to look at, because people who are having these struggles, they're very closed off to input and advice. But there's always someone who they look up to, who they think they should listen to. For the most part, there are exceptions to that too. Yes.
These are mainly I have experienced people like this in my life, and they are mainly master technicians. So that master technician needs to listen from a master technician.
Yeah.
Then that's how it helps.
And that, I think we agree that there's a pattern there, that's a strategy that we wouldn't probably work 100% of the time, because there are some master technicians who think they answer to no one, and they just have to hit rock bottom probably before they're open for insight. But let's get on to the exercise. I appreciate the questions though. What you're going to do for the next 5 minutes, just spend some time alone and make a mental note or some written notes about a trigger event, something that you reacted to in an undesirable way. That's the only requirement, okay? But I want you to spend some time preparing to share with a partner here the details of that story. Do we have any questions? A moment where you reacted in an undesirable way, and how much do you know about what may or may not have triggered it? That's our assignment for the next 5 minutes. I'll start the stopwatch now.
Yeah, so the story that I would like to share is that some time ago I was heading an event, and an event is something that, as you can imagine, is very stressful to deal with, because you're dealing with a lot of balls, thrown into the air. It's a big juggle. And as I was working closer to the event, I felt this need to have support. And I asked my HR to give me, help with some, at least 1 or 2 people who could help me with the project. And so they sent me 2 interns to work with me. And one of these interns was a really smart, capable boy, and he was, hit the road running from the moment he joined my team. And the other one was kind of sluggish, and he, was, very, smiling a lot, and very sort of lackadaisical about his approach, and would come in late, saunter in, every day, half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour late. As I kept my wits end with this fellow, he couldn't communicate well. He was all the time, in my face, and I had to deal with him. And what I started doing was, obviously, because this was an event which of big measure, I started giving the other boy, the smarter boy, a lot more work, and myself a lot more work. And I was overworked. Both of us were working that many more long hours. And this other one would saunter in late, and I'd say, well, you've come in late. And my excuse to him would be, work has already been allocated, so you hang around, do things, help out, do whatever. I would never give him really any amount of work. And what I was doing is, I was in no way helping the situation, neither him or myself. And in the process, I was also getting really angry with him every single day. And as the event came closer up, the date of the event came closer up, there was a lot more things to do, so many more balls to juggle. And there came a point when we as a team needed to be in 3 different places at the same time. And so I needed to be with a certain set of people. This other boy needed to be with a certain set of people. And there was another place that we had to go to. So who was the other person to send this to? Was this boy, the third boy. I said, well, this is your moment of reckoning. It's happening. I'm going to be giving you an assignment, but you better not screw up. And I was my talk-down approach, almost contemptuous, to the extent of being that, this is the stuff, and you tell me what's happening, and blah, blah. That's my tone, and that's my, talk-down approach to this boy. And he was this, okay, ma'am, don't worry, I'll do it. His approach was always this, and he'd make mistakes time and again. So I was like, please do not screw up. And I was that firm with him. I was looking down at him like that. And I left, he left, he left. I came back from my meeting, and I said, so what happened? He said, ma'am, these 4 things happened perfectly. Yeah, I did it perfectly, all happened and all that. But these 2 things went wrong. And I said, what? And I, showered the choicest of, yelling and screaming at him. The whole office was, privy to this whole, tirade that I came down with. And then he says to me, but ma'am, wo maine kar liya, it's sorted. I have managed to figure it out. I found solutions to that. So I said, oh, so why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you make me scream and shout like this? So he says, Ma'am, bolne hi nahi dete ho. In Hindi, it means that you don't let me speak. You're all the time screaming. So, and I realized, and here's this boy, and he says this with a smile, Ma'am, you don't let me speak. So how am I supposed to, So I felt really, horrible, and I, went across and I hugged him and I said, I'm so sorry, and I said, okay, now let's get back to work. But what happened with that was, that boy actually broke ice for me that day and taught me a huge lesson that you need to just empower people. Yes, mistakes will happen. We all make mistakes. I made lots of mistakes in my career. I was making a huge mistake with this boy all along. And the reality of the fact is why I did that was, I was sharing with my partner here that it stemmed from fear. And I was constantly worried that I shouldn't look bad because of this kid. The point is, if I'd just given him a little bit of chance, he would have shipped up. And he did. And he did those solutions as well. And that's, at the end of the day, what I wanted to share.
It's a great story.
Yeah, thank you.
What I found when she was telling the story, she was completely into it. And, that moment, she's a very good storyteller, of course. So she built up the suspense, and finally when she said that, I think I made a mistake, and finally she came and said, the fear was, I shouldn't be seen that way by people. And then the moment of realization came. So I say my story too? Sure. Okay. In a way, it's a minor story, but I think it really made me feel very good afterwards. Is that this is a very common incident that we tend to forget our mobiles in the cab, and I had forgotten mine, but I'm a practicing doctor, so when I reached my clinic, by the time I reached my clinic, I said I have forgotten my mobile, and I'm a psychiatrist, so there are so many WhatsApp and so many messages in this which are, bombs for some socially known people. If somebody opens the phone, they will get horrible secrets of their life, which I never wanted. So it was very important that I get the mobile phone back. So, it was an Uber cab, so no phone and something. So I called my son and he gave the number of the taxi wala. We rushed and got the telephone back. To cut the long story short, we had to travel here and there. My colleague was there, very nice. They helped me, and then we went and came back. And on my way back, my colleague said to me, you have been teaching mindfulness and you have been doing all this, and today look at you. You looked so agitated. And I said, was that the case? So I said, oh my God, this is moment of truth. I mean, at the real moment when I'm being really challenged, I don't really practice what I've been teaching. So then I held her hand. I said, really tell me, was I really angry? To which she said, no sir, I just pulled your leg and said that. You are quite calm. But then but it triggered. And now I look back and I said, I was agitated. There's no doubt about it. Because there was a lot of fear in my mind. Actually, there did not have been any fear. Essentially because all the solution had been worked out. Everyone was extremely cooperative, including the taxi driver, my son, Uber, everyone in the world was very cooperative. But my fear was working. It's like the amygdala had already hijacked my prefrontal and was, making me feel very bad. But that was very nice. And one of the reasons that I was also agitated last moment, because when I trying to call my wife and say, where is the number, blah, blah, blah. When she finally picked up the phone, first thing that she said, now you know when people don't pick up the phone, how it feels. So I said, the moment of truth came from two women, one my colleague and the other one my wife. But I don't know about the second lesson I have learned or not, but the first one I have learned. Thank you very much.
So we'll wrap this up. I have a gift for you two. This is actually signed by Dr. Daniel Goleman, and there are 12 books in here. I'm a co-author on 4, and Dr. Richard Davidson is a co-author, who you saw in the video. Thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you everyone for your participation.